Hi, I'm Aang, and I'm joining Chris Smit for the Culture Matters podcast.
All right, let's do this. Aang, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, welcome. Nice to have you here. So, on the Culture Matters podcast on international business, my first question is pretty much an obvious one. Is tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you are right now, and what would you consider being your cultural frame of reference? And with a cultural frame of reference, I don't mean 2 weeks in Cancun in Mexico, right? A little bit more like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Uh, yeah. So a little bit about me. I'm Aang. I am a life and leadership coach, and I only just recently transitioned into this role. I've been a social worker and an advisor for leadership teams for most of my career, mostly in the violence prevention field. Where I transitioned from violence prevention into diversity and inclusion, where culture comes up a lot.
Yeah.
And then from there, I kind of transitioned into leadership teams, working with leadership teams. And for me, my culture is unique in that I grew up in Southeast Texas, which is very different, I think, than the rest of the United States in terms of its beliefs, its education levels, its poverty levels, and many other areas. And so for me, I had a really hard time as I kind of moved away from Texas. I went to school, I went to grad school, and navigating the complexities of the transition from Southeast Texas into the Northeast, which is where I went to college.
Hmm.
And was consistently made fun of because I had an accent, because I had beliefs about the world that were just simply not true. I had a really religious background, and so letting a lot of that information go from my childhood, and just all kinds of things about other people's culture that was taught to me that obviously was from a very biased and very ignorant frame, I'll say.
Uh-huh. Okay, and where are you now? Because we missed that part.
Yeah, I'm in Washington, D.C. And so I lived in Vermont for about 10 years. Then I moved to D.C. for, I think, around 7 or 8 years before moving to Poland and now back to D.C.
Okay. And can I ask you about your name? Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So,
So my name,
because it's a different name.
yeah, my name is actually a chosen name. So I'm non-binary, and I lived for quite a while with a feminine name that made people kind of assume a gender for me.
Hmm.
And because of that, I was non-binary for about 10 years, and people would consistently mix up my pronouns. They would call me she, her. I decided I wanted to have a name that didn't automatically assume a gender for that. And obviously, I was adamant to want to choose a name that was meaningful and powerful for me.
Hmm.
And I happened to choose Aang because I love the meaning of that. And it's
Yeah.
I didn't share this with you earlier, but it's peaceful soaring, and it was kind of
Okay.
in alignment with my spirituality and where I was, and also kind of how I wanted to live my life. And so, yeah, I ended up choosing this as a new name for myself.
All right. Okay. Well, um, I was going to say congratulations with your name, but that has been for some time in any case. So you're the first person with a name like this on this podcast, at least. I've got a couple of questions for you, and as I told you before recording, I don't prepare that much. Um, but I prefer to go with the flow. There are a couple of things I'd like to check out with you. You talk about the role of conscious leadership in modern organizations. That's one thing you talk about. Does that mean that most of us run around like headless chickens? Or conscious leadership.
Yeah.
What does that mean in this context of culture and cultural differences?
Yeah, when I talk about consciousness, I talk about it at the base level, and I define consciousness as just a general awareness of ourselves, of other people, and how
Hmm.
we all interact. And I think it's actually a really great fit for talking about culture because we all have different cultural backgrounds. And I shared a little bit about being from the Southeast. I work in Washington D.C. and I lived in other places, and all of those different places have kind of shaped and molded me into the person that I am today. And that is just within the context of the United States.
Yeah.
We're not bringing the international context into play here, with the exception of I did live in Poland for 2 years, which did change me in many ways. But even if we just keep it at the US level, like every single state has like its idiosyncrasies and its religions and its areas that people are drawn to, whether it's accents, whether it's uh, um, religions, whether it's other areas. And so I think when we talk about consciousness and being aware of ourselves and being aware of others, it's a matter of recognizing that those differences, whether they're personality differences, whether they're religious differences, or whatever they are,
Mm-hmm.
can only help the organization learn and grow as an entity. And so when I talk about consciousness, I do find a lot of times people do not put a lot of thought into who are they, where are they from, how is that impacting their working dynamic with individuals, and especially in the international context. So I work for an organization that is um, has to be international in nature, and so they do a lot of different things all over the world. And I also work with a lot of companies all over the world. And so it's a matter of like, we can't separate the United States from the rest of the world anymore. I know it used to be a lot easier to do, but we're working in
Mm-hmm.
a global context.
Yeah.
And so not only do we have to be able to navigate our cultural differences within the United States, but we also have to do that now on a global level. And without jumping too much into some of the areas, I will say like many leaders have not done the work to know and understand what are the different cultures that I'm interacting with. And I will be honest with you, I've worked with leadership teams who have multiple different cultures in their office on their teams, and they still don't understand the basics of other people's identities and their backgrounds and how it relates to the work that they're doing there. And
Yeah.
so I do think that we do need to help leaders wake up in this area.
Um, There, as I said, I prefer to go with the flow. I don't prepare that much, but so triggers a lot of questions. For the people that are listening, we're recording this on the 28th of October, 2024, which is about 9 days before the election and polarization and politics. And what you're talking about are intra-cultural differences, the differences within the United States versus intercultural differences, say your example, Poland and the United States. It's a hard thing, right? It's a difficult thing to do. Is this possible to educate leaders like this?
Yeah, and that is the question. I'll say, and two things come to mind when I talk about this, or when I think about this right now. And the first thing is a leader that I worked with for over 6 months,
Yeah.
working with him every day, at least 2 hours a day, really trying to help him to understand how he needed to kind of shift his thinking in a specific area. And it took a significant emotional event with one of his daughters before he could even open his mind to the possibility that the things that I was saying was true, and that specifically in this case it was about gender dynamics in the workplace, and specifically how women are often marginalized
Hmm.
and left out of senior leadership positions, and some other things. But like, he couldn't understand the impact of socialization, specifically around gender dynamics.
Hmm.
And it took his daughter telling him something about not being able to be president, and the like, because that was emotional for him, because he said to me, I have raised my daughters to believe they can do anything that they want to do in the world. I am constantly encouraging them and empowering them to do all of these things. And he said, they're 7 or 8 years old, where is this idea coming from? And
Yeah.
I'm like, they do interact with other people, they do go out
Absolutely.
into the world.
Yeah.
And like, so it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. People have to want to do it. And many times it's not going to be the conversations that I have with them that are going to actually shift their dynamics. Something emotional is going to have to happen for them in their lives for them to be open to the possibility. And so I'll say that. And then sometimes people never become open to the possibility. And an example that I'll share on this
The
is,
possibility that there are other cultures that think differently.
yeah, and maybe not so much even that there are other cultures that think differently, but that as leaders we need to be aware and we need to adjust
Hmm.
our actions and our behaviors based on that. And
Right.
so, like in this leader's case, he thought that sexism wasn't real, and therefore he didn't need to do anything about it, you know. And
Okay.
so, ever since he had that shift in his thinking, he became one of the biggest allies that me and one of my coworkers had to be able
Hmm.
to advocate for women into leadership positions, getting
Yeah.
women into leadership positions. And so the other thing is, I shared a little bit about my background. I grew up in severe poverty. My parents both struggled with incarceration and substance use. But one thing in particular that really stuck to me that's in this area is, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer
Hmm.
close to the first election for President Obama.
Okay.
And I cannot remember for the life of me who he was running against at the time, but Obamacare was huge on the talking sphere. And I was having a conversation with my mother about this, and my mother she didn't finish high school. She doesn't have any education or social connections, social networks, or anything along those lines that kind of would help her kind of raise her consciousness in that area. And she was adamant about the fact that she was not going to vote for Obama because of the fact that he was forcing people to have health care, and trying to have a conversation with her about, like, you do realize that you are the person that is going to benefit from this. Like, you're not going to be the one who's going to pay for your
It's
health
society
care.
that will do that. Yeah.
Yeah, like the whole purpose of this is for everyone else who has enough to help people like you who don't have anything. Like, you literally are about to die because you don't have appropriate health care and you have cancer,
Yeah.
And like trying to have that conversation. I'm getting a little emotional, but
No, it's fine. It's fine. I appreciate the
it's like
intimacy.
these beliefs are so ingrained in our heads, and not only that, but in the society and the culture that we're in. So she didn't know anyone except for me that had a different perspective
Hmm.
that could help her to understand. And I honestly, I never got through to her. She ended up dying not too much longer after that.
Sorry
You
to hear
know,
that. Yeah.
oh, it's okay. Thank you. um, yeah, and so it is deep, and getting people to kind of pause and to reflect, to let go of their ego, to let go of that socialization is a really difficult thing, and some people never make it.
Is this? I'm referring to you spent 2 years in Poland, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Do you see a difference between Poland and the United States? Because what you're describing, what you're painting, and again, thank you for sharing the intimate details. Is this something? Can you see a difference between what we maybe do in Europe or slash Poland in your experience and what's going on in the US? Because what you're painting in the US for me is a very obvious thing. In other words, why should I pay for your health insurance? You pay for your health insurance. That is sort of the black and white view that's currently still going on with this upcoming election, the polarization, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see a
Yeah,
difference there?
yeah. Well, oh man, where do I want to start? So I think most people know that the majority of Europe has a universal health care. I'm a big advocate for universal health care. And having lived there for 2 years, even not as a citizen, I still got to enjoy the benefits of having an example. This might be a little too much, but I have to get MRIs regularly because I have a traumatic brain injury.
Mhm.
And I would get MRIs in the state. It would be extremely costly.
Oh,
Like, their
absolutely.
quality's not as good. I had to get MRIs in Poland. It was super easy. I paid like $20 for
Mhm.
an MRI that my neurologist is like, this is way better than your last MRI.
Yeah.
And like, it's totally different world. And I think, you know, having talked to people who lived in Europe who had universal healthcare, and having talked to Americans who also benefited from the healthcare systems over there, and the conversations, like I met this one guy in I think it was Ireland. He shared a story of how his wife ended up breaking her leg, had to go to the hospital, had to get surgery and all kinds of things. They left the hospital, and the hospital was so apologetic to them because they had to charge them like $10 or $15 for the entire hospital visit. And he's like, "Are you kidding me? This
Yeah.
would cost $10,000 in the U.S."
Oh yeah.
And so it is a very different dynamic
Yeah.
and culture. I think, you know, trying to draw a parallel to the United States, I will say that, you know, especially Eastern European countries, they have their own struggles. And,
Hmm.
you know, I obviously as a non-binary and queer person living in Poland, it was a little different for me. And I also had to deal with a lot of people in the US not understanding why I would choose to make a decision to live in a country that doesn't have laws that protect me as an individual. And so, you know, I think
Mm.
anywhere you go, you have to kind of weigh the pros and the cons. But
Yeah.
I have only good things to say about universal health care.
All right. Well, that's not okay. Well, thank you for elaborating there. Is
Yeah.
another thing that comes up and that comes to mind here is typically with this polarization going on, not only in the United States, but it's pretty much around the world, is being woke. What is your and within a cultural framework, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's okay. You can answer about your with the context of the U.S., but try to make it a little broader.
Okay.
Um, and aren't we becoming too woke, or is this woke period coming to an end? What's going on here?
Yeah. Personally, I don't like the term woke, especially because I feel like it's a polarizing concept or term.
Uh-huh.
I think, you know, I talk about it in terms of increasing our consciousness. I think of it as very similar things. And so for me, when I think about increasing our consciousness
Yeah.
around matters of cultural identity and those kinds of things. I shared before, we are in a global world, whether we choose to admit it or not. And any company that's going to survive in the future is going to have an international context as part of that. And so if we as leaders and we as organizations cannot navigate that cultural divide and be able to use cultural competence to our advantage in the
Hmm.
workplace, then those companies, personally, I do not think will survive over the next 20 years. And when I talk about this with leaders, so, you know, right now, I recently did a leadership series with a company that is actually based in Eastern Europe somewhere, but they have fellows that join their program from all over the world. And
Hmm.
so we had a lot of African countries that participated in our training, a lot of European countries. We had a couple of people from the US, but the conversations that these individuals have about how they're being expected to perform based on US markets and US standards,
Right.
and
Yeah.
how that impacts them as individuals coming from, in some cases, third world countries who have like no idea what it's like to live and work in the United States, but being forced to kind of change their behaviors to fit into that context.
Uh-huh.
And I think we're missing the mark when we're asking people, and in many cases, not even asking, but telling people, like, this is the culture that you need to fit in to be a part of this organization, instead of approaching it from, we've got all of these individuals from all over the world who are all bringing these diverse perspectives. How can we use that to our advantage in terms of innovation and creativity, and bringing our organization to the next level? And
Hmm.
so, again, I think probably one of the most important and impactful things that organizations can do in the next 10 to 20 years is going to be able to harness their cultural intelligence when it comes to working in an international context.
I'm digesting what you're saying, listening to what you're saying, and mirroring that on my own experience, which brings me to another topic here, is that you talk about diversity and inclusion, From my perspective, seen from my perspective, I'm not talking about gender diversity or gender inclusion or educational or age inclusion and stuff like that. I'm looking at it from a perspective of cultural inclusion and diversity. So you are American, right?
I am.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you're American, I'm a Dutchie. You come from Texas, you live in DC now. I was born in Amsterdam. You're talking to me at this moment when I'm in Paris. Um, so diversity, etc. In this context, isn't that more window dressing than a reality? Or should I bite
Yeah,
my tongue?
I think one of the ways people fail when we talk about diversity, inclusion, belonging, and those kinds of concepts is that they have a very Americanized view on what that means. And in this case, Americanized is not in a positive way, but rather in diversity means gender, race, and sexuality. Those are the three main things. Sometimes religion is thrown in there, but for the most part, people typically only think of those three areas.
Yeah,
And the reality is there are so many different characteristics that make people unique.
absolutely.
And being able to recognize, not even, I know you do a lot of work in international context, even in the American context, there are so many different characteristics. And like, if we can't understand the basic characteristics in the American context, then I think it's going to be much harder for people to be able to grasp and fully understand the need to understand the international context.
Mm,
And I think too, when people think of the international context, it's very biased in that they have to be able to speak English and their accent has to be perfect. And if they can't speak English and they don't have a good accent, then they're not going to be a functioning member of our team. Or if you're going to come to the United States or you're going to work for a U.S. based company, then you have to abide by our religious calendar, and there's no awareness that not everyone is a Christian and not everyone follows the Christian holidays. And like, just if we can't get the basics of, language and religion and those kinds of things, it's going to make it much harder to really
all
dive
right.
into, someone from, the Dutch background is going to be very different than someone who lives in Paris. And someone from Paris is going to be very different from someone who lives in Eastern Europe,
Yeah.
and like really dive into the nuance of those cultures. And so, it's the same argument, I think, as what's the difference from someone who grew up in Southeast Texas versus someone who grew up in the Northeast. But at the same time, like, there are additional layers that go into that because of the language and because of the other areas. And so it's complex, I'll say, but I think for me, I try really hard to help people understand what is the basics. So letting go of the idea that diversity is only about, race,
It's not
ethnicity.
only that, it's more than that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Good points. Yeah. All right. Listen, I'm looking at the clock here and looking at the recording. We're about 30 minutes into the recording. I'd like to ask you two more questions, if I may. And that is, if from your perspective, from your experience, work life, private life, whichever angle you want to take, can you give us three tips to become more culturally competent, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talk with leaders about increasing their consciousness, there are three main aspects that I talk about for this. And so I'll share those as the tips. And that is um, integrating reflexivity into your lifestyle. And what I mean by reflexivity is a cycle of self awareness, self evaluation, and self adjustment. And so when I say integrate reflexivity, I mean, I don't only want you to reflect on who you are and how you are, I want you to get feedback from other people, and I want you to adjust your behaviors and your actions to fit the person that you want to be or need to be as a leader. And so, one, I would say reflexivity,
Okay.
integrating reflexivity. The second thing I would say is be intentional in everything that you do. And so if you've started with reflexivity, you know what you need to work on and you know how you need to work on it, then you need to bring intention to that specific area. And you need to think about it multiple times throughout the day, every single day. And so
Wow.
when you bring intention to that, then you're
Uh-huh.
helping yourself to learn and grow in your different environments. And so in the context of cultural matters, talking to your teams every single day, making sure you understand what are their unique needs, what are their concerns, and how can you support them in that, and being intentional in how you respond and react in the future.
Uh-huh.
And the last thing I'll say, number three, would be to live in congruence. And what I mean by this is to make sure that your behaviors and your actions match the words that you speak. And this is one of the biggest ways that leaders specifically tend to lose trust, is because they say things that they know are politically correct and that they're supposed to say, but their actions and their behaviors are not in alignment with that. And as soon as individuals hear them say diversity and inclusion is great, we support everyone, but then
Right.
they are not supportive of you in whatever your aspect or characteristic is, then that automatically tells me that I can't trust you, or they can't trust the leader. And so live in congruence with your actions and your words.
Good. Nice stuff. Good stuff. 3 points. They'll be in the show notes. Last question I have for you. How can people get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you?
Yeah. So the best way is email ang@increasingconsciousness.org. But I am also on most of the big social channels. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, and I am on YouTube. And I think you just search Aang Lakey and my information will pop up. And I also have a website, increasingconsciousness.org.
That's the advantage of having a different name, right? You're very
Yes.
findable, if that's a word, in Google in this case.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right, Eng. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. And I'm pretty sure we'll talk to each other in the future.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.